The problem with pen and ink is that you can only write down one version of a myth, one version of a fairy tale, and there's no such thing as one true version. In my very first couple of drafts, I recognized that I was writing the traditional fairy tale one-dimensional tropes, and that bothered me because one of my pet peeves is how in fairy tales you're told what to think. It's the wicked stepmother, it's the wicked witch, it's the wicked stepsister, and it's usually the women who are defined as wicked. Cygna starts off as very weak. She doesn't think for herself. She lets herself be controlled and manipulated because she knows nothing else, and she has to destroy that part of herself. She goes through her transformative death, and she really has to discover who she is as a person. And that is a very painful process, as emphasized by the amount of blood and dismemberment in the story. And then when she gets to her mother's glade and she's about to make the descent, she realizes that what her father meant by she's going to turn monstrous is that one day she is going to think for herself and leave him.
Hi everyone, this is Annalisa with Journey to the Goddess TV, where I regenerate ancient feminine wisdom for modern women. Today I'm with Dr. Ashland Pym. Hi, Ashland.
Hello.
Ashland is an author and a mythologist and a recent doctor of mythology. And I've invited her here today to celebrate and to talk about her new book called The Serpent and the Swan. So let's dive right in, Ashland. I just love that you made a modern fairy tale. And at the end of the book, you really bring the reader into your process. You talk about the mythological themes, you talk about the character themes that you brought in. So can you give us a brief summary of your book and also your inspiration for writing this particular story?
Oh, of course. The main character, Cygna, is the first illegitimate daughter of King Torvald, and she is half fae, so she has a swan wing in place of her left arm. And because of this, she is considered unnatural and is hidden away, deemed unfit to rule. So on her 20th birthday, Queen Gita convinces the king to send Cygna off to try and defeat the Lindworm, which is a creature from the other world that is harrying the borders of the kingdom and making its slow march on the capital. So Cygna is sent off to what turns out to be not just one of the other worlds, but the underworld itself. And when she arrives in the underworld, she discovers that the king is under a curse of his own. And so she is having to redeem not only her own kingdom, but the country she is born from as well, which provides all sorts of shenanigans. I won't give up the end of the book.
Yes.
But that's the gist of it.
Right. It's really about this heroine's quest of redemption, as you said somewhere in your author's note. It's about redemption.
Yes. Yeah, most fairy tales have some sort of redemption arc, which isn't faith-based redemption as we often think of the world, but more of a psychological redemption. And I don't think I can quite remember exactly what the inspiration for this story was, apart from that the person with a swan wing in place of an arm has always been an image that stuck with me. And it tends to show up a lot in my writings. And this is the first one that's actually been published with that motif. So no one has a chance to be sick of it yet. It started as a 5-page short story that I wrote for our fairy tales class at Pacifica. And I was just very much taken with the motifs we were studying of redemption and divestiture. And another one of my favorite fairy tales is a Scandinavian tale, the King Lindorm, which is very much about divestiture, about removing the layers in order to make personal change. And this is a psychologically and physically traumatic event. And I was just fascinated and really wanted to work with that. But I'm not interested in writing from a male perspective. So naturally, even though the Six Swans, which is where the character with the one wing comes from, and King Lindorm are both men, they've had centuries to tell their stories. It's our turn.
Yes, yes.
So those were the two images that stuck in my head, and somehow a story came out of it. I just sat down and I wrote what I felt like at the time. When I finished my dissertation, the short story was the only thing creative I had written in years, and I was really struggling to get back into it. I was sort of stuck in between worlds of academic and creative, and liminality is such a huge part of this book too. And they say that authors write themselves in, and that the first book is autobiographic, and I'm probably revealing far too much of myself, but that is definitely the case in this story. I picked up this story that I had written for the fairy tales class, and I dusted it off, and I sat down, and it was just going to be a short story. I was thinking at the time that I just wanted to create like a collection of new fairy tales, and each one was only going to be about 10 pages. And before I knew it, it was 40 pages. And then the revision after that was 60 pages, so on and so forth. So yes, it's there was a lot that I felt needed to go into it.
I'm curious too. So those of you who don't know Pym, Pym is from the United States. We're actually both from the Seattle area. And she ended up traveling to Ireland during her doctoral thesis writing and research phase, and you ended up meeting somebody and falling in love and getting married, and now you reside in Ireland. So kind of in my mythic imagination mind, I just am curious if even the setting in which you find yourself kind of helped propel this story forward.
Oh, absolutely. As I said, the origin of one of the stories is Scandinavian. It's King Lindorm. So there's already a bit of a Norse feel to it that I really kind of tried to carry through the story itself. But even though Norse is a mythology that I absolutely love, the Irish keeps creeping in, and Irish myth and folklore is intrinsically tied to its landscape. And even what I mentioned earlier about liminality, so much of the story is liminal space. And in Irish mythology, any occurrence of note happens in liminal space, whether it's between worlds or just at the edge of a forest, or borders, or at the edge of water. And even where I'm sitting now, I am in a small cottage at the mouth of Connemara on a land bridge between two lakes, right on the border of two counties at the edge of a forest.
I see, yes.
And I myself am in liminal space because of, I was supposed to get my residency, and the pandemic has prevented my immigration papers coming through.
Oh no.
But liminality is so steeped into the landscape that I'm in and in my personal life that it couldn't help but come out in the story. I mean, one of the major settings is the Mother's Grove, which is a space in between this world and the next, and as a result, operates by its own rules. And of course, Cygna herself, she's a daughter of one world and the next, and she can never quite decide which one she fits in or which one she wants to fit in. So yeah, being in Ireland has definitely affected how this book was written, or novella.
Yes, definitely. And really giving you this very visceral, direct experience, constant experience of liminality. So it's
yes,
a direct experience of something within the lineage of Irish mythology.
Yeah. Yes, the sequel is going to have a lot more Irish seeping into it.
Okay.
I tried to prevent it.
Okay, good. I'm glad there's a sequel, because I got to the end and I was like, I have to find out what happens. What happens?
Yay. Yep, it's the first in a trilogy. It
Okay.
was going to be a standalone, and then I just wanted to keep writing. So here we are.
Oh, I love that. I love that you were so excited by the story. You're going to keep going.
Yeah, I've become very attached to Cygna.
So I want to talk about the female characters. So I'm not sure if you intentionally wrote a feminist fairy tale. There can be women-centric stories without it being feminist per se. So the point is that what you've created in this fairy tale world are three-dimensional characters for both men and women. And typically, at least what I remember seeing in our fairy tale course was, these very one-dimensional archetypal figures, right? And it's very clear who's the good girl, who's the bad girl. And usually the good girl's the heroine, and the bad girl are the queens or the sisters and stepsisters. And what I saw in your fairy tale is that all of these female characters have their good qualities and their bad qualities. They're three-dimensional, they have depth. And so I found myself always kind of in conflict, where I really wanted to be on the side of Queen Gaida. I really wanted to be on her side. And then I would feel conflict when I would read, in the beginning, for example, I don't think this is giving too much away, that she goes on a witch hunt. She kills the witches. And I'm like, no, no, but I was feeling really sorry for you. So there's this constant conflict. And even with the king, he has his, even though he's the cause of the wasteland, basically, it's like he has his redeeming qualities as well, And so I really loved being in conflict. But so circling back to the female characters, did you intentionally write this as a feminist fairy tale? And or how did you go about creating these female characters? What was your intention behind that?
I don't think I set out to intentionally to write a feminist fairy tale. I am a feminist, so that's naturally what I ended up writing. I did in the revision process, and to be fair, a lot of this happens in the revision. It's all about your first draft. You read what your unconscious wants to tell you, and then you try to interpret what themes it's trying to throw at you. And then you can see whether or not you can force other themes into it. In my very first couple of drafts, I recognized that I was writing the traditional fairy tale one-dimensional tropes. And that bothered me because one of my pet peeves is how in fairy tales, you're told what to think. It's the wicked stepmother, it's the wicked witch, it's the wicked stepsister. And it's usually the women who are defined as wicked. And then in one of the revisions, I ended up writing a sentence about how Queen Gita was resentful of King Torvald's control over her. And that really just sort of opened up for me what a lot of this book was really about. He's a very controlling, very possessive man. And that's, I think, what causes the wasteland. And another thing that has always been a pet peeve of mine is, and this is usually where women are concerned, is the assumption that something can only be one thing. Like I myself, my very first job was as a shepherd. So I would spend a couple days a week mucking sheep muck out of a barn and, doing all sorts of very unpleasant jobs. And one day, one of the other workers came to me and said, when you came for your interview, I honestly didn't think that you could cut it because you're so femme. Exactly. I had the exact same result, that someone who is feminine, whatever that is supposed to mean, and I'm sure we'll get into that in a minute, but whatever is feminine can't be practical. We can't be three-dimensional creatures. And I particularly love to, and this is even before I wrote this book, I particularly love to use the swan as an example of this. When I first moved to Ireland, it was the first time I'd ever seen a swan in the wild. Mm-hmm. And they are a huge part of the mythology here, and they are very much loved even today. And so when I first arrived, I was taking all these beautiful photographs of all of these swans I was seeing everywhere and posting them on my Facebook and things like that. And a lot of people came back with, but they can break a man's arm. They're vicious creatures. It's like, well, yes, but that doesn't detract from how beautiful and elegant and incredible they are, just because they'll defend themselves. And after I got that response, I really started thinking about how, well, first, that the swan is a wonderful example of consent. She's beautiful, she's elegant, and if she doesn't want you to touch her, she will you up. But also it really emphasized for me that particularly where women are concerned, we really have this way of thinking in our culture that women aren't allowed to be more than one thing. And I really wanted to emphasize that in this book. Cygna starts off as very weak. She doesn't think for herself. She lets herself be controlled and manipulated because she knows nothing else. And she has to destroy that part of herself. Queen Gita is angry and resentful and hurtful and spiteful. And a lot of that is because she too has been controlled and manipulated. That's also part of her nature. She can be kind, she can be cruel. It's like the goddess who gives life with one hand and takes with the other. We're all two things.
Right.
So yes, that was part of when I realized that this particular book would be considered a feminist fairy tale. It was all part of showing that women aren't one-dimensional, and we shouldn't believe that the queen, that the stepmother is wicked just because we're told that she is.
Apart from it being a really great book and fun, and I don't read a lot of fiction, just, I don't know why, that's just not who I am, but I really want to, and I really hope that people see that, whether they get that consciously or not. I really hope that seeps into people's unconscious when they read this, because the work now for feminists is to teach people that women have depth, and that we're three-dimensional, and that we can have these negative and positive qualities, desires, wants, needs, you know, instead of projecting some kind of feminine ideal onto women.
Yeah.
Get to write the story of who we are. And you're literally doing that.
It's my preferred method of teaching. I tried being an academic, didn't much like it, despite the fact that I got a PhD in it. So I'm doing it through fiction. The only unfortunate thing with fiction, and with academia too, to a certain extent, but with fiction, the most effective is also somewhat ambiguous, I think. Opens things up to a lot of interpretation. So, and also a lot of people need to be hit over the head with things, and I try not to do that. Although there are a few things that I feel like I hammered home a little too much.
Everything felt very equally balanced to me.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Of course, we have to talk about some of the mythological themes in here. That's what makes it so fun for me as a mythologist to read through. Now that I've been through the mythological studies program, I'm like, oh yeah, that's the wasteland theme. Oh, that's the descent theme, you know? But I really want to focus on how the feminine shows up through those themes. So can you elaborate on that for us?
Absolutely. First, I have to define how I think of feminine. I think that that an understanding of the feminine is highly individualistic. For me to define to myself what is feminine also means that I have to define what is not feminine, and that's where I always stumble, and I always contradict myself when I say, "Oh, this is feminine. This isn't feminine," etc. So when it comes down to it, I think of feminine as being one half of the generative spark. And that's for me really where the wasteland comes in. King Torvald is such a possessive and controlling man that he extinguishes that spark in the women in his kingdom, first his wife and then his daughters. So for me, the wasteland in this book, it's not just about how the monarch represents the state of the kingdom. It's also about how King Torvald treats the women, who are traditionally the creators, the nurturers. But what we forget a lot is that creation biologically needs one of two halves. He is not providing, he's only taking. And so for
his will on them, right?
Pardon? Yes, he is
himself and his will.
He's imposing his will. He's treating them like dolls, which is why I named him Torvald.
I know. It took me a minute. I was like, Torvald, what's that name? Yes. Oh, Torvald. Yes, a doll's house. Yes.
Yep.
I was so happy in that moment. Okay.
It was a moment, a really wonderful clicking moment that writers often experience. In my very first few drafts, none of the characters except Cygna had names. I was determined that this was going to be, one of the fairy tale tropes that I kept. And when it got so big that I finally had to stop giving everybody proper titles and all that, and actually had to give them names.
Like the father, queen.
Yeah, the king, the queen, the woman all in white, etc. So I knew that it was the Norwegian version of the King Lindorm that I was working with. So I went and I looked up a bunch of names of Norwegian kings, and there was Torvald just ripe and waiting for me. And I thought, oh, I'm constantly describing him as treating Gita and then Cygna as dolls. Perfect. Yay. The writing gods have smiled upon me. So yes.
So perfect.
Yeah. So yes, it's him playing dolls with the women in his life that kills that generative spark that is needed for the land to regenerate itself. You have your beautiful little dollhouse. You have your little dolls, and you control how they dress, you control how they talk, how they think even, and there is nothing beyond this dollhouse. It is complete wasteland. And when you walk away from it, nothing happens. The doll dies, in essence. And this was an image that really stuck with me and may now have just now occurred to me. So when you're playing dolls with something, you're taking away its agency. When you walk away from it, you don't expect it to think for itself, and you don't expect it to act for itself. It can't create. It has no generative force. And so him treating his wife and his daughters like dolls it's a destructive power.
Yeah, because it's lifeless. And that's the wasteland. And you beautifully tied it in with her journey, her descent journey and ascent journey, and how the descent and the journey of the descent then reignites the generative spark. So let's go into the descent motif a little bit.
My pleasure. Most of my studies at Pacifica, even though this didn't really make it into my dissertation, most of my studies were centered on the underworld journey. I couldn't tell you exactly why the underworld is a mythologism that sticks with me and I love above all others, except for maybe tricksters. Cygna's descent and ascent is very much that mythological motif of the Nikia. It is the transformative death. She can't go back the same way that she descended. She has to find a new path. When you're a different person, you can't retrace your steps. She goes through her transformative death. She has to destroy the old person who didn't think for herself, didn't act for herself, who believed everything that her father told her. And she really has to discover who she is as a person. And that is a very painful process, as emphasized by the amount of blood and dismemberment in the story.
Yes.
And of course, there's the psychological interpretation of the Nikia. When we descend into the underworld, we're descending into the unconscious, our raw self. So a lot of what happens in the underworld is a direct reflection of Cygna's inner turmoil and also the kingdom that she's come from. There's a direct correlation between the court that she sees in the underworld and the court of her father's court, with its masks and its subtleties and its double faces and all of that. So she has to make peace with a lot of that before she can lift the curse, before she's allowed to escape the underworld and bring back that generative force and discover her own generative force before she can ascend.
Right. And there's something that's occurring to me in this conversation. There's something about the descent to the underworld that's distinctly feminine. And it's not that men don't have their own underworld journeys. That's not what I'm saying. But when I think of the first story we have of the descent myth, which is the Inanna descending to the underworld, and you brought up Persephone in your author's notes. There's something about the underworld as the womb tomb and the death and rebirth energy that's encompassed in the womb tomb. Something about distinctly a woman's journey of going down and within to the womb. This is my kind of projecting onto your story, but it's like there is something about an introduction into womanhood that is a descent journey, a woman's wholeness. Womanhood, however you define that, but there is a biological component to it, I believe.
So many thoughts all colliding all at once. I love to hear people's interpretations and projections because it gives me insight into my own story that I didn't even know. Now, to your particular interpretations, I am very pleased by. Yes, I would absolutely say that Cygna, as biologically female, definitely is descending into her own womb, discovering her own womanhood and her femininity, because she had all of that stolen by her father. Yes, she had her governess, but this particular character is hinted at in the books as not being at all a positive effect in her life. All of her thoughts about herself, be it about her half-faeness or her own womanhood, is directly the result of how her father sees women. And he may thinks that he loves women, but he just wants to own them, possess them, control them. So
kind of the epitome of that male projection of the anima onto women.
Exactly. And so she herself is nothing but her father's own anima projection. And so when she descends into the underworld, she is descending into her own womanhood, and she has to discover what it is to be a woman. I will say that I'm thinking of ways of working this into book 2. We'll see exactly how it comes across. It's obviously everything goes through several revisions. One does not want to smack their readers in the face with their own womb.
Wait, did you say womb or wound? You said
womb. Although wound is good too. I will say that living in Ireland, I am very privileged to have living examples of womb tomb everywhere around me, because we have all of these 5,000-year-old passage tombs dotted all over the country. And it's been my absolute delight to be able to go into Newgrange several times already, and to be there for the solstice one year, not inside the chamber, but it was even just being outside of it, and the ritual that was taking place, and it was potent. You could feel at that time, hand in hand, both the death and rebirth all encompassed in this, not just this place, but particularly this one moment of a shaft of golden light coming into the darkness and piercing into the chamber that holds the cremated remains of the bodies there. The Irish approach to death seems to be unique in that it's held space here. We actually talk about it here. Whereas, particularly the United States, it's very hushed terms. It is amazingly a very popular topic here. Almost every conversation starts with, you're one down the road. Dead now.
So there's a humor about death too.
Yes, there is a great deal of humor about death. We have wakes here, which is a party that's sort of held before the funeral, and games are played and there's singing, and it's absolutely amazing how the Irish are so open and almost joyful about death, while at the same time holding solemnity for it. And I really feel like these tombs that dot the country, they reflect that, in that the passage tomb, the cruciform, almost womb-shaped, womb and tomb, that, yeah, we call them tombs, but a lot of archaeologists and anthropologists suggest that there were all sorts of rituals that were held in these places. They're not just a place of burial. They're also a place of rejuvenation and rebirth. And that's really emphasized, particularly in Newgrange. It's not the only tomb that opens up to the winter solstice, but it's the most famous, obviously. That too, I'm sure, has had its own reflection in this book.
You had a lot of color symbolism in this book as well. And on the one hand, it reminded me of some of the color symbolism in alchemy. You had like white and red and black and green. So you have all this wonderful color symbolism in there that I know is very intentional. But again, because of my own doctoral work with menstrual blood and menstrual blood symbolism, I was really taken in by the repetition, or this motif, this repeated motif of women's blood that came through. It started with Lady All in White, her hand, the blood from her hand, and then Cygna's blood later on, her finger and also her wing. And even though that blood, it was not vulvic, it didn't come from the vulva, there was something about the particularity of it being a woman's blood, and woman's blood to regenerate, the power in women's blood, basically. Could you elaborate maybe some on your use of blood in this story, of women's blood in that way?
My pleasure. In the fantasies that I write, I really like to harp on the symbolism of blood as life force. So Cygna descends into the underworld, into that, descending into her own womanhood, descending into womb. So, and she unlocks it with blood. She plucks one of her feathers and she places it into the hole of the stone. And when that floats down and touches the ground, it opens up the cavern into which she descends. The underworld is typically associated as the land of the dead. I don't go into that in this book particularly. It'll become more of the sequel. The land of the dead, at least in my interpretation and in how this book world is, it's not the end. It's not where life force goes and is no longer. It's a pool, and life force goes into it, life force comes out of it. And women's blood is a potent symbol of this, that conduit of life. So it is both death and birth, giving and taking. So Cygna uses her blood to unlock her entry into the underworld and opens the door to the underworld itself with blood. And then at the base of the ladder that she descends, there is the great big door with all of its spirals and whorls and the two intertwined snakes with the lock. And she's wounded herself on the ladder coming down, and sorry, wrong hand. And she takes the splinter from her finger and she puts it in the lock. And later that finger is taken away because she's been using this key, and I'll let you all read the book to find out all of the specifics. But yes, blood becomes a very important symbol for opening up doorways and discovery and regeneration.
There is this connection between women and monstrosity. And I know in your author's note that you talk about monstrosity broadly in, in fairy tales, how it can be male or female, but then you also bring up examples of Medusa. And I think it's really important to talk about how women or female characters get demonized in stories, and how that itself becomes normalized.
Even in our culture today, even though we like to think that we've evolved past this, but we demonize and monsterize women who think for themselves, who act other than how we traditionally view femininity. Regardless of how you feel about her personal politics, Hillary Clinton was a perfect example of this.
I was going to bring that up because somebody made a picture of her as Medusa.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And as you mentioned in my author's note, I talk about how we demonize anyone who is outside of what we consider normal behavior or normal looks. In my story, Cygna is, she's a woman who throws off conditioning and mental abuse and starts to think for herself. And when her father realizes this, he says outright, "What is wrong with you?" And that's right before she makes her descent. Cygna has spent her entire life being told that, because of her fey blood, she is going to become monstrous. And she spends her entire life afraid that she is going to give in to this heredity, hurt someone that she loves, or, if she steps out into the world, that she'll be just consumed with a desire to eat human flesh. I don't know, whatever the fairy tales, that's what they're telling her is going to happen to her, and the impulses that she will have. And then when she gets to her mother's glade and she's about to make the descent, she realizes that what her father meant by she's going to turn monstrous is that one day she is going to think for herself and leave him. And that's exactly what she does.
When we project that fear of monstrosity onto ourselves or one another, it's debilitating, basically. We can't discover and be fully who we are.
Yeah. When we call somebody monstrous, we're telling them that I don't know how to relate to you. I am uncomfortable with how to relate to you. And that makes me angry. That makes me afraid.
What we see then as monstrosity is a projection of our own fear. I mean, in the case of Cygna, she's an example of living your life in fear of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Because of what?
Yes, and other people telling you to live your life in fear of yourself. When you have narratives surrounding you, telling you who you are, and none of those narratives are in any way a positive depiction, of course you're going to end up with all sorts of mental trauma and conditioning, and you can never fully individuate. You can never become who you are, and that can make a person very angry, as Cygna in the next book is very angry. Part of the motif that I worked with is that with Cygna Swanwing, she's not all human. She is in part bestial, and that makes her closer to nature, outside of society, looking in. And she really embraces that other part of herself when she descends to the underworld. She becomes very passionate. She becomes very angry. She becomes that part of herself that she has been cutting off for 20 years. And when she ascends again in the next book, she doesn't know how to control that bestial anger. And that in itself is its own monstrosity, because she accepts part of who she is, but she still hasn't fully discovered herself, because she only redeemed the underworld kingdom. She hasn't redeemed her own yet. She hasn't redeemed herself. It's coming to grips with what others would consider monstrous, and that she needs to relearn her own humanity, not to fit in, but to learn not to become what everyone expects her to be, and told her what she would be.
Right. That really, really helps me understand Medusa a little bit better, and Ereshkigal, and even Inanna. Why is Inanna so angry when she comes back up from the underworld to kill her spouse?
Yeah.
These are deep, important questions about women's anger. And I think that what the Me Too movement has revealed is that there has been a suppression of women's wholeness, women's anger that we haven't been able to honor it or see it or explore it. And so now it's starting to rise up to the surface from the underworld.
Yeah. We've been told all our lives that women are too emotional. We can't control our anger when it comes out. And that's when the snakes come out. That's when the scorpion tail comes out.
To kill men specifically too, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So yeah, we've been told our entire lives that when we become angry, we become monstrous. And so, yes, of course, we are giving into a certain amount of that right now. And we could probably learn how to rein that in a bit. I'm not saying that we should. There has to be a lot of anger to learn how to gain middle ground. The stupid cliche of, the pendulum swings. It goes from one extreme to the other, but it has to come back to the middle eventually. Right. I'm sorry, I don't mean middle to mean centrist politics, but
I more or less think like the Buddhist way, like the middle way.
Exactly. Women, especially with the Me Too movement right now, we need to express that anger. And yeah, maybe a bit of what others would consider monstrous needs to come out. The snake hair is coming out. And once we have catharted that anger, we can come back a little bit and achieve balance.
Yes.
That's my interpretation anyway.
Women's anger is pathologized. There's a difference between experiencing anger, which is natural, and projecting it out on taking it out on other people.
Yes.
So I'm not advocating for taking anger out on people, but I am advocating for women to feel it and express it.
Precisely. We've been conditioned to force our anger into the shadow. And that means we have an unhealthy relationship with it. And when that happens, the shadow comes out in toxic and destructive ways. And
I'm excited to see how you write the second book then.
Yep, I'm excited too.
Ashland, would you please honor us with a reading, a passage from your book?
It would be my pleasure.
Okay.
I've got my beautiful copy here. It says not for resale because this is my proof. I have yet to receive the actual author copy. I won't get those for another month. I'd be happy to read from chapter 2 for you.
Great.
To Queen Gyda's dismay, a natural daughter did nothing to deter King Torvald's interest in his firstborn. If anything, he showed his little swan maiden favoritism. She was a new doll for him to dress and mold as he saw fit. Try as he might to keep his daughter's existence a secret, his frequent disappearances could not go unnoticed, and rumors spread with distressing accuracy. He assumed that her wet nurse Batilde was the source, so he locked her away with the baby and sent a royal guard to inform her grieving family that she had been eaten by a wild animal while walking the king's wood. It was Batilde's own mother who answered the door, and she listened without a word as the man described the manner of her daughter's death. He gave a bloodied shift as proof. Batilde's mother ran her hand over the stiff brown stains as the guard repeated the king's personal condolences. She remembered every stitch of the forget-me-nots she'd embroidered to strengthen the seams. When the guardsman was gone, she washed what blood she could out of the linen and used it to swaddle her now motherless granddaughter. To the outsider, however, Princess Isla was the king's only child and heir. Queen Gyda hoped to keep Isla in ignorance, but as the child grew into the age of curiosity, she was fascinated by the servants' gossip of an unnatural older sister locked away somewhere in the castle. It also did not escape her notice that her father was rarely to be seen. She took every opportunity to slip away from her nursemaids and search from dungeon to towers for any mysteriously locked doors or unexplained guards. To quell her daughter's interest, Gyda filled Isla's head with stories, the cruelties of the fairy race, and all the horrible things that would be done to her if she met one, even a half-breed, even a sister. Queen Gyda commissioned storytellers to revive the old fairy tales and compose ballads and plays, illustrating the treacherous nature of the fae and their delight in human prey, popularizing a new genre of entertainment both in court and around the hearth. And as the pestilence that rotted the fields spread further through the kingdom year after year, with starvation hard on its heels, people found an explanation to their misfortunes. It was either lost to memory, or it did not matter that King Torvald's seduction by a fairy woman and the arrival of their progeny had come more than a year after the first signs of blight. Mobs aided the queen's knights as they dragged suspected worshippers to the pyre. Batilde's family, who still suffered from the loss of her income, had no explanation for how such a hard-working girl could have time to wander the Kingswood. They listened to the fireside fairy stories and the rumors of the Swan Maiden, and knew it was no wild beast that had devoured their beloved Batilde. It could only be the king's fairy get, and soon their friends and neighbors knew it too. King Torvald responded to this fear-mongering by eliminating any who had seen Cygna's true form and denying her existence. Her only companion was her governess, imprisoned with her, and only he, her doting father, might come and go from her rooms. She did not remember Batilde enough to ask what had become of her once Cygna was too old for a wet nurse. The king protected Cygna by isolating her, but it pleased him that in so doing, he had no other rivals for her affections. She could not help but learn of her stepmother and half-sisters through her lessons in history and government, but he assured her of their cruelty and hatred toward her to keep her from longing for them. He made no mention of her true mother or her heritage, but she could not help but make a connection between herself, And the lady all in white her father spoke of seeking, and of the terrible stories of the Fae her governess told her at night. It could not escape Cygna's notice that she was different to her father. She was forever in trouble with her governess for tearing one arm off her doll and attempting to sew a wing in its place. When pressed, her teacher would tell her only that her wing was a curse of her father's sins, and she needed to cleanse herself of its stains. For her, it was a different curse. With only one wing, she could not fly from her window to explore the lands she looked out on, or find the lands she came from. And with only one arm, she could not walk among the people as one of them, nor could she quite decide which she wanted more. But she knew it did her no good to wish or dream for the future. For what future could she possibly have, unable to appear in court and locked away from prying eyes? And what good would it be to fly away when there was no safe place to go to?
When you hear somebody read a story out loud, or when you hear something spoken rather than reading it in your head, it hits you in different ways. But I'm like mourning the tragedy, of her life in that moment.
It was a difficult few passages to write. It's funny, when you asked me to write a passage and suggested that I select the one I had the most fun writing, I really had to sit down and go, did I enjoy writing any of these passages? So much of it is so traumatic, which is quite the opposite of who I am. I'm very jovial. I love to entertain. I love to laugh. And I sometimes feel like my writing commits the ultimate sin of taking itself too seriously. I'm aware that I need to inject far more humor into my books. There is so much of this book that is so traumatic, both for the reader, the characters, and the writer.
Even though this is a mythical world, it's still very human.
I prefer to write about people first and myth after. I prefer to ground things solidly in reality. Mythological motifs are mostly for underscoring the humanity of it.
In a way, it's like learning to see the world we live in mythically in and of itself, because it's all around us.
Absolutely. It's amazing how much myth still drives our day-to-day lives and impacts, the things that we read and the way that we view the world. It's so very woven into just day-to-day life.
I would like to touch on your dissertation. I would have to say, from how you described your dissertation to me, it seems like it kind of helped lay the foundation, or the template maybe, for your work moving forward. So your dissertation is called?
It's The Virtual Myth Conservancy, a framework for virtual heritage and game-based learning. Well, essentially, it identifies that one of the biggest threats to the conservation and preservation of myth and folklore and fairy tales comes from pen and ink, which is hard to say as a writer. It's the apathy of storytellers and entertainers who oftentimes say, oh, that's an interesting story. I'm going to pluck out this motif, or I'm going to pluck out this name and use it in my own. And then it'll have that same weight, that same spark of fascination. But they rarely pay respect to all of the motifs surrounding and the cultural significance. And I'm not saying that this is true of all storytellers and all entertainers. I have seen quite a few films and played many video games that have taken their inspiration from myths and folklore and have done an excellent job of respecting their origins. And as a result, those invented myths and those invented stories have a lot of emotional weight and a lot of psychological weight. But a lot of times I'll pick up a book or I'll watch a film, and it's the equivalent of, say, if I wrote a book about a woman who was kidnapped and sold into sexual slavery, and she breaks free and has to murder her way through the ranks and kill the ultimate pimp, Jesus Christ. That is very shocking to a lot of people because in Western culture, we grew up in, a culture shaped by Christianity, but it's the rough equivalent of what a lot of writers and entertainers are doing. Mm. They're taking something sacred well, not just something sacred, something important, something meaningful out of its original context.
From a particular culture and place and time.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And I'm not saying that one can't use these, but it's very important to respect the motifs and the culture that they came from. Otherwise, they just fall flat. They have no more significance. And a lot of retellings of myths and fairy tales, unfortunately, when they're updated, fall short of these same problems. The other problem with this is that when you're telling stories from a different culture, and I do have to, stick my foot in the very sticky topic of cultural misappropriation in sections of this dissertation. Ultimately, what it comes down to is that when telling the stories of a different culture, you are telling them stories about themselves and probably getting it wrong. As I've already mentioned, that is a very large part of the Serpent and the Swan. Cygna is constantly being told stories about herself. They're by people who are afraid. They're by people who don't understand the culture that she was born out of. And so she is never given a positive example of herself. And so in my dissertation, it centers mostly on video games because I'm a passionate gamer, as you can probably see from the, only bookshelf that is not in my bedroom and therefore just scattered. The problem with pen and ink is that you can only write down one version of a myth, one version of a fairy tale, and there's no such thing as one true version. These are oral histories. They were meant to change with the time, with the region, with the audience, with the storyteller. They constantly changed in a reflection of the culture that they were in. And when men came and wrote them down and put them in ink and bound them in the books, that's when that oral tradition ended. And we have lost so much potential in evolution out of that. And as much as I love the written word, I feel that video games are, or other forms of digital storytelling, be it video games or interactive fiction or visual novels or things like that, they have an interactivity about them. And based on a game's design, can have various different endings. So this amorphous nature of the video game is the perfect medium, I think, for myth, and particularly myth conservation and preservation. I distinguish the two because preservation is keeping something as it was. That's where pen and ink is very good. It writes down one version that does not change. Conservation is taking something and allowing it to evolve. I think that nature is actually a really good metaphor for this, not only because I am married to an ecologist, an environmental scientist, but the wood that's outside my window right now, we could preserve it, keep exactly the plants that that are there, for all eternity. But climate changes and there are all sorts of different environmental changes around it. It's, if we keep it exactly how it is no longer fits its environment.
Right.
And therefore
in that sense, it becomes sterilized in a sense.
Exactly, yes. And it can become in its concretization also quite literally in the sense of environmental sense. If something isn't allowed to change, pestilence breeds, it becomes toxic. The same is true of not letting myth and fairy tale and folklore change. That's where conservation comes in. What I particularly love about video games as a medium for myth conservation is that it's a space that allows for that change to happen within wider culture, also with the player itself, depending on the choices that the player makes and how it interacts with the story. It really goes back to that two halves of the generative spark that I was talking about between creator and audience.
Yeah.
With a book, I write a novel, or in this case, novella, and the reader interprets it according to their own, their own complexes, their own projections.
Yes.
With a video game, nothing happens without the player's action.
active.
Nothing can move forward. And that's essentially my dissertation. And as far as the conservation goes, I created a framework because I realized that video game designers and heritage conservationists approach the same subjects from two very different angles and can have difficulty communicating. So I aimed to construct a framework that would help game designers understand conservation and connecting something in its cultural heritage, but also help heritage specialists understand what is needed to make a good game. You know, players aren't going to play something that's not fun. I've been on both sides of the spectrum. You know, I've played games that try to treat heritage subjects as a game and just are terrible. They fall flat. No one's ever going to play it because it's not a game. It's not fun. There is the whole debate of whether or not games need to be fun, but I'm not going to go into that. You can go read chapter 2 of the dissertation. But I've also played a lot of video games that really want to treat ancient myth and past, but it loses a lot of context in making the game an actual game, in the mechanics and things like that. And so while that is the heart of the framework, most of the dissertation is in trying to discuss, okay, so what is accuracy? What does it mean to ground something in its cultural context? What about the effect of narrative on cultures, things like that? It doesn't seem on its surface to be totally relevant to what I'm doing now, but yes, my dissertation has very much informed a lot of the books that I'm writing now.
I see it as totally relevant. First of all, you gave me a new appreciation for games.
It is a controversial subject. Once more, it's narrative. So much of the media controls the narrative of how people who've never played games see them. But just like, Rambo isn't all films, Call of Duty isn't all video games. One of my absolute favorite video games is Dragon Age, which does deal a lot in mythology. And it's one of the reasons I'm so passionate about it, but it's also just a brilliant game.
The main thing that I see is that it seems that what you've created with the Serpent and the Swan is kind of almost the book version of the video game, because it's porous enough that there's different interpretations.
It's funny you mentioned that, because a lot of my dissertation is talking about what I originally started thinking of negative space storytelling out of using term from art. And I've come to realize is within the industry similar to environmental storytelling. It's about giving the audience enough clues that they develop their own interpretation of what the story is, or what the vignette within that moment is. I feel very strongly that way in writing, whether it's for video games or for books. I don't want to hit my audience over the head with what I think they should think, what I think their takeaway should be, exactly what all of the events of the book are. I leave it very open-ended about what happens to Batilde, because I've given enough clues about what sort of man the king is that they can draw their own conclusions, a fact which drove my editor nuts. I want the audience to think for themselves. And I feel like leaving a lot to ambiguity serves my purposes there.
And so if you had any advice or wisdom that you would like to share with other women writers who are looking to tell women's stories or reclaim women's stories, or even just tell old fairy tales for a modern audience.
Oh, yes. This goes in a bit to the whole, there is no one true version. I know that a lot of us feel very strongly about some versions. Fortunately, right now, there's a lot of scholarship being dedicated to finding these other variations. One of my personal favorite ones, and I name check who wrote it down, but I don't remember off the top of my head. There's another version of Red Riding Hood in which she saves herself. There is no huntsman. And when the Grimm brothers wrote down the fairy tales for their own selections, they looked at these various versions and went, it's important to us to emphasize the role of the woman as underling to a man, so we're going to put this version that has the huntsman in it, because she can't be seen to save herself. She can't be seen to think for herself.
Right.
Look to the alternative versions, look to the older versions. As far as creating new versions, just remember, as I said earlier, to keep things in their context. I fully recommend studying up on what the motifs are, the meaning that they have, and then take your own interpretation of that. And if you're self-publishing, for the love of the gods, get a professional editor.
Okay, that's great advice.
And by all means, I am more than happy to talk to people who, who are looking to write, new fairy tales and, just all of that. So reach out to me. I'm happy to talk.
Oh, great. Thank you. Why don't you let people know how they can find your book, how they can either contact you or just find out more about your work generally.
Beautiful cover that my cover designer came up for me. The Serpent and the Swan. The ebook right now is only available on Amazon, which means that if you have a Kindle Unlimited subscription, you can read it for free, but I will be taking it wide in 3 or 6 months. It'll be available on Barnes & Noble and Kobo and all that. And for print, it is also available on Amazon, but it should also be through all major distributors right now. So you should be able to go into your favorite bookstore and ask them to order you a copy. I highly encourage that. They should be able to find it via author name or title, but the best is to give them the ISBN, and that's in the show notes or is on my website, which is www.pymspen.com. And that's also where you can contact me if you want to reach out and talk about fairy tales and all of that jazz. So, oh, and the audiobook should be coming out soon. I don't have a distinct date on that yet because, with pandemic and constant in and out of lockdown, studio time has been hard to get.
You're reading it?
I am. Yes. I've just always preferred audiobooks in the author's voice personally. I love listening to Neil Gaiman read his own books because I get to hear how it was in his head. So,
yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The takeaway is that it's available on through Amazon right now.
Ebook or print through Amazon. And then in 3 to 6 months, it will be available on ebook through all other major distributors. When that happens, you can also request the ebook through your library. And right now, the print book you can request through your library. And when the audiobook comes out, you can request that through your library as well. And if you are just looking to purchase it, will be available through all major distributors. Yay, libraries and local bookstores.
Ashland, this has been so much fun. Thank you for coming on my show and talking to me about your wonderful book.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
You're so welcome. And for everybody else, thank you. If you like this video, please like it, please share it, and please subscribe to my channel. And if you want to support me on Patreon, I have an account there where you can find out all about membership starting at $3 a month. So thank you, everybody. And thank you again, Ashland. And we will see you next time. Ciao.
Bye.